March 21st, 1986, Barents Sea, along the northern coast of the Soviet Union, 37,000 feet, Mach 3.18. Lieutenant Colonel Ed Yalding, pilot of SR-71 number 61-7972, tightened his gloved hands around the control stick as the jet's nose sliced across a horizon of pale, Arctic light. On the other side of the Blackbird's titanium skin, the temperature hovered around 450 degrees Fahrenheit. But inside his pressure suit, he felt a controlled, almost artificial chill. Outside, the air did not flow smoothly over the aircraft. It vibrated in stacked shock waves. At this speed, the SR-71 did not fly through the sky. It rammed a tunnel through it. In the back seat, Reconnaissance Systems Officer Lieutenant Colonel J.T. Vida listened to the synthetic voice of the astro-inertial navigation computer. His display showed the Soviet coastline approaching fast. Murmansk, Severomorsk, Polyarny, the headquarters of the Red Banner Northern Fleet. Then the RHAW, the radar homing and warning receiver, lit up. SA-5 Gammon launch. Range and elevation confirmed. The tone was unmistakable. One of the most feared weapons in the Soviet anti-aircraft arsenal, a missile designed specifically to kill high-altitude, high-speed intruders, had locked on to them. Then another, and another. The screen filled with threats. Long-range radars from Olenegorsk, Nikkel, and Novaya Zemlya were painting the jet. The giant P-14 Tall King radar, capable of tracking targets at 600 kilometers, surged to full power. Yalding heard no fear in Vida's voice, just a dry, knowing calm. Multiple acquisitions. They think they have us. They always thought they had them. On the ground, Soviet PVO Strany, the air defense forces, crews shouted across bunker corridors, pointing at radar screens that showed a target no aircraft had a right to be. It was too high, too fast. Their interceptors, the MiG-25 Foxbat, would never reach it in time. Their missiles, the SA-2 and SA-5, could not climb fast enough or predict the target's flight path. They had seen it before. And here it was again. Every Soviet radar operator knew the American machine overhead, the SR-71 Blackbird. Every Soviet commander knew the humiliation attached to that silhouette on a scope no missile had ever hit it. And yet, in the early 1960s, the Blackbird's critics, American and Soviet alike, had laughed at the idea that any airplane could outrun a missile. On radar scopes across the Arctic, the SR-71's return drifted off the screen, not because it had been shot down, but because it was already gone. This is the story of that aircraft, the real story of the SR-71 Blackbird, a machine dismissed by experts who insisted that no jet could outrun Soviet missiles, that the moment it entered hostile airspace it would be blown from the sky. It is the story of the missions that proved them wrong. Missions over North Vietnam, along the Soviet frontier, during the Yom Kippur War, over North Korea after the seizure of the USS Pueblo missions, that forced the Soviet Union to rebuild its entire air defense network. It is the story of how Lockheed's Skunk Works, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, engineered a machine so fast and so high that every missile fired at it missed a machine the USSR feared but could never catch. This is the story of that aircraft. The real story of the SR-71 Blackbird, a machine dismissed by experts who insisted that no jet could outrun Soviet missiles, that the moment it entered hostile airspace it would be blown from the sky. It is the story of the missions that proved them wrong. Missions over North Vietnam, along the Soviet frontier, during the Yom Kippur War, over North Korea after the seizure of the USS Pueblo missions that forced the Soviet Union to rebuild its entire air defense network. It is the story of how Lockheed's Skunk Works, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, engineered a machine so fast and so high that every missile fired at it missed a machine the USSR feared, but could never catch. It is not a story about dogfights or aerial heroics. It is a story of industrial logic, thermal physics, titanium metallurgy, and strategic reconnaissance. A story of how American engineering created a jet that turned the most advanced Soviet missile complexes into spectators and left Soviet commanders admitting, after the Cold War, we could track the Blackbird. We could aim at the Blackbird, but we could never touch the Blackbird. The SR-71 was born from panic. On May 1st, 1960, a Soviet S-75 Dvina, known to NATO as the SA-2 Guideline, shot down a CIA U-2 spy plane flown by Francis Gary Powers inside the Eisenhower administration. The shock was immense. The U-2 had been considered untouchable at 70,000 feet. It wasn't. When the wreckage appeared in Moscow, largely intact, the lesson was clear altitude alone no longer guaranteed safety. Earlier, in 1957, Sputnik had already shown that the Soviet Union could put objects into orbit. In August 1960, with Sputnik 5 and other launches, American intelligence agencies faced a terrifying question that now had fresh urgency. How do you observe a country that can shoot down your spy planes? The answer would eventually come from a small, secretive Lockheed division in Burbank, California, Skunk Works. In 1959, the CIA approached Kelly Johnson with a set of requirements that bordered on insulting to any engineer who understood the limits of materials and engines. The new aircraft would have to fly above 90,000 feet. It would have to cruise at Mach 3.2 or faster. It would have to outrun the SA-2 missile. It would have to remain stable at skin temperatures above 600 degrees Fahrenheit. It would need a radar cross-section too small for reliable tracking. No aircraft in history even approached those numbers. Even inside Lockheed, engineers doubted it. Many said openly, you can't outrun a missile. Missiles were faster in straight-line acceleration. Soviet radar coverage was dense across the USSR. Thermal loads at Mach 3 were beyond anything aviation had yet seen. But Johnson believed the opposite. He believed that if an airplane traveled fast enough and at high enough altitude, the missile's energy would decay before it could reach the target. The concept was not fantasy. It was physics. Missiles could accelerate quickly, but they could not sustain Mach 5 at 90,000 feet for long periods. Their rocket motors burned out, after which they coasted, losing speed rapidly in the thin air. An airplane with nearly unlimited fuel at altitude could do what a missile could not: maintain extreme speed for minutes, not seconds. This was the cornerstone of the Blackbird concept. The first embodiment of that idea was not the SR-71. It was the CIA's A-12 Oxcart, a single-seat reconnaissance aircraft built in deep secrecy. On April 26, 1962, test pilot Lou Schalk took the first A-12 into the air. The aircraft achieved Mach 3.29 in official records and altitudes above 84,000 feet. It became, and remains, the fastest air-breathing jet ever flown. But the public never knew. It flew in total secrecy. The SR-71 would be the Air Force variant, larger, with 2 seats, longer range, heavier, more sensors. But the fundamental DNA was the same. To make that aircraft work, Lockheed needed an engine that by standard definitions should not have worked at all. The Pratt & Whitney J58 was not a normal turbojet. It was effectively a hybrid between a turbojet and a ramjet. At around Mach 3, the engine bypassed roughly 80% of the incoming air around the turbojet core. The aircraft became, in effect, a ramjet with a turbojet stuck inside it. Temperatures at the inlet exceeded 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Shock cones in the inlets had to sit in precise millimeter-perfect positions to hold the shock wave at the lip. A single misalignment caused an unstart, a violent event where one intake lost shock control, the engine surged, and the aircraft experienced a sudden asymmetric side slip. Despite the danger, the system worked. And it worked better than many had predicted. When engineers said an engine could not survive such heat, Kelly Johnson's response was simple. Then we'll build it out of something that can. That something was titanium. The Blackbird required a material that could survive skin temperatures up to 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit in local hotspots. Aluminum would soften and melt, steel would warp. High-temperature alloys like Inconel were too heavy for an aircraft that needed to be large, sleek, and fast. Johnson chose titanium. There was a problem. In the early 1960s, the United States had almost no titanium industry capable of producing the necessary quantities and purity. Most of the world's titanium sponge was produced by the same country the aircraft was meant to spy on, the Soviet Union. To build the SR-71, the CIA quietly created shell companies to purchase Soviet titanium through third-party fronts. It was an irony lost on no one inside the program. The Blackbird was built using Soviet metal to outrun Soviet missiles while flying on the edge of Soviet airspace. That something was titanium. The Blackbird required a material that could survive skin temperatures up to 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit in local hotspots. Aluminum would soften and melt, steel would warp. High-temperature alloys like Inconel were too heavy for an aircraft that needed to be large, sleek, and fast. Johnson chose titanium. The early days were rough. On the ground, the SR-71 famously leaked fuel. JP-7 dripped from its panel lines and seams on the ramp. It was not a design flaw. At Mach 3, the aircraft's skin expanded several inches. Only when heated by friction did the tanks seal fully. Critics in Congress and outside, it mocked the design. A jet that leaked fuel was, in their eyes, a jet that didn't work. In reality, the leaks were part of the thermal expansion strategy baked into the aircraft from the beginning. Out of the 32 SR-71s built, 12 would be lost to accidents. None would be lost to enemy fire. Early losses were seized on by critics as evidence that the aircraft could never operate safely in hostile conditions, but the airframes and crews adapted. Procedures changed. Thermal management improved. Pilot training deepened. And then came the missions that would silence the doubters. The Vietnam War was the first true proving ground. Operation Giant Scale and other missions pushed the Blackbird deep over North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese operated SA-2 guideline missiles and Fan Song radar systems, manned by Soviet-trained operators. From 1968 onward, SR-71s flew reconnaissance runs over Hanoi, Haiphong, and the Chinese border regions. Each mission triggered massive radar activity. SA-2s were fired more than 800 times at Blackbirds. None hit. The reason lay in the design envelope. The SA-2 was simply not built to support interception of a target flying above 85,000 feet at Mach 3 or more, with the ability to make even small course corrections. Intercept solutions required predicting where the target would be in the future. At Mach 3, even a 1-degree turn shifted the intercept point by miles. The missiles and their guidance systems could not compute the geometry fast enough or sustain the chase long enough. In that thin, high air, North Vietnamese reports repeatedly carried the same note. Target too fast, target too high. Soviet advisors were blunter. We can track it, we can shoot at it, we cannot hit it. On January 23, 1968, North Korea seized the intelligence ship USS Pueblo. Capturing 82 American crewmen, Washington suddenly needed up-to-date intelligence on North Korean movements, air defenses, and Soviet fleet reactions. The answer again involved the SR-71. Beginning January 26th, Blackbirds flew from Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, running missions that skimmed the edges of North Korean airspace. At Mach 3, North Korean MiG-21s scrambled constantly. They never got close. These flights returned imagery and electronic data on fleet movements, radar networks, SAM site locations, and troop concentrations. The Pentagon later acknowledged that SR-71 intelligence from these missions helped prevent a possible escalation into a wider war. In the Middle East, the aircraft played a similar role. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched coordinated attacks on Israel in what became the Yom Kippur War. Israel was caught off guard. Within hours, U.S. Defense Secretary James Schlesinger ordered SR-71 reconnaissance over the region. Flights launched from Griffith Air Force Base in the United States, refueled repeatedly over the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and reached Mach 3 over Sinai and the Golan Heights. They mapped Egyptian SAM deployments, Syrian armor positions, aircraft dispersal locations, and Arab-Soviet supply routes. Israeli officials would later state that SR-71 intelligence altered the course of the conflict. Egypt and Syria attempted missile lock-ons. None succeeded. The real test, however, waited farther north. The SR-71 never overflew the Soviet Union after 1960, President Eisenhower's ban on manned overflights after the U-2 incident remained in place. But the Blackbird flew along the borders, close enough to trigger full air defense mobilizations without crossing the line. The missions included runs along the Baltic and Barents Seas, over the approaches to Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula, down the Pacific side near Kamchatka and Vladivostok, Arctic routes near Novaya Zemlya, and Black Sea approaches. Each time, Soviet reactions were immediate. On the ground, the SA-5 Gammon, the S-200 system, first deployed in 1966, represented the Soviet answer to high-altitude intruders. Its range extended out to 150 to 300 kilometers. Its speed reached Mach 4 to 5.5. It could theoretically reach above 60,000 feet. The SR-71 routinely flew at 80,000 to 85,000 feet. It cruised at Mach 3.2 or slightly more. In those conditions, missiles launched at the Blackbird would claw their way up through thinning air, their rocket motors burning out, their airframes coasting, losing energy second by second. U.S. Air Force monitoring of these launches told a consistent story. Every SA-5 fired at an SR-71 missed. In the air, the MiG-25 Foxbat was the USSR's fastest interceptor. In brief bursts, it could reach near Mach 3 and altitudes around 80,000 feet in a zoom climb, but it could not sustain those conditions. Engines risked damage. Fuel vanished rapidly, and the MiG still faced a target that was already at Mach 3 and high altitude, with the option to turn, climb slightly, or accelerate. Post-Cold War Russian interviews would summarize it simply: "We attempted interception. We never achieved firing position." The Blackbird's biggest enemy was not Soviet missiles. It was the Blackbird itself. Shockwaves entering the intakes had to remain perfectly aligned. If one intake momentarily lost shock control, the engine unstarted. In an instant, asymmetric drag grabbed the aircraft. It yawed violently. Crews were slammed in their seats. Equipment tore loose. Airframes approached their structural limits. Crews learned to handle it. Training was brutally rigorous. Procedures for restarting, for manually adjusting inlets, for managing unstarts at Mach 3 became second nature. The Blackbird survived not because it was easy to fly, but because the crews that flew it were extraordinary. And so, back to the Barents Sea, March 21st, 1986. After the Soviet SA-5 batteries launched, Ed Yalding and J.T. Vida did nothing unusual. They did not throw the aircraft into wild, evasive maneuvers. They did not dive. They did not climb. They did not make sharp turns. They simply maintained Mach 3.18, 83,000 feet, and a smooth, predictable course. The SA-5s arced upward, losing energy in the rarefied air. Their guidance computers struggled to calculate intercept points against a target moving nearly a mile every second. As Yalding and Vida crossed the Norwegian Sea, the R-Hall lights faded. On landing, Vida delivered the mission's data: radar mapping, fleet positions, air defense readiness levels, missile launch telemetry. It was intelligence no satellite could have captured in time. This single mission helped the United States calibrate its understanding of Soviet Arctic defenses, data that would remain useful until the end of the Cold War. Years later, a Soviet colonel would admit what the numbers already showed. We fired, we prayed, we saw it leave our screens. We knew we had missed. In 1990, the SR-71 was retired. The reasons were straightforward and political: high operating costs in an era of shrinking budgets, a growing belief that satellites were enough pressure from within parts of the Air Force that preferred other systems, aging airframes that would require investment to keep flying. Crises did not stop. In 1995, Congress restarted a limited SR-71 program. NASA also operated Blackbirds for high-speed research. But by 1998, the Air Force abandoned the program permanently to this day. Many in the intelligence community argue that the retirement was premature. No aircraft since has matched its combination of speed, altitude, and responsiveness. Over its career, the SR-71 collected imagery covering millions of square miles. It flew more than 3,500 operational sorties. It was fired upon over 1,000 times. It was never hit. It reshaped how nations thought about reconnaissance. It proved that missiles did not automatically guarantee territorial security. It forced the USSR to invest billions in new radar and missile networks. It provided real-time data in crises that satellites could not handle. Its very existence became a psychological weapon. In later interviews, Former Soviet officers were blunt. The appearance of the Blackbird forced us to redesign our entire defense posture. It made us feel blind. From the American side, Kelly Johnson often called the Blackbird the most satisfying aircraft we ever built. Pilots echoed that sentiment. Brian Schul, who survived severe burns before becoming a Blackbird pilot, described the view at speed. At Mach 3, he said, "You get a sense of the Earth's curvature. The Blackbird shows you the world in a way no other aircraft can." From the Soviet side, the verdict was equally clear. After the collapse of the USSR, Russian generals were candid. "We never shot it down. We never even came close." The hard numbers matched the statement. 0 combat losses, 0 successful interceptions. The idea that an airplane could outrun missiles had once been mocked. By the 1980s, Soviet doctrine quietly acknowledged that the Blackbird operated outside the envelope of all known interceptors. In the late 1950s, critics said that no jet could outrun a missile, that no aircraft could fly at Mach 3 for hours, that no engines could survive those temperatures, that no pilot could endure the demands of the pressure suit, that no titanium aircraft could be built in quantity. They laughed at the entire concept. By the 1980s, that laughter was gone. The SR-71 Blackbird flew for 25 years, gathering intelligence across the world, changing Cold War strategy, and exposing the limits of Soviet air defenses. It retired undefeated. Undefeated not in dogfights, but in the colder, more unforgiving realm of mathematics, where a few miles per hour and a few thousand feet can determine a geopolitical balance. It proved that speed was not just a number on a gauge. It was a form of invincibility. And in the quiet corridors of Soviet air defense command posts, where radar screens once filled with the impossible return of a target too fast to be real, the Blackbird left behind a silence more profound than any explosion, the silence of an enemy who knew they could never catch you.